Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward, and I'm really excited for our guest today. Our guest today is Brigadier General Robert S. Spalding, U.S. Air Force retired, author of the recently released book Stealth War: How China Took Over While the Elite Slept. Available everywhere books are sold, well, in the free world at least, and on Audible, where it's read by Ray Porter. He was commissioned in 1991 via Fresno State's University ROTC program, shout out to the Bulldogs, and into the Air Force, where he learned to fly B-52 Stratofortresses and later the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. He was selected as one of 3 Air Force Olmsted Scholars, and as part of that program, he entered Tongji University in Shanghai as a graduate research student, where he embedded in Chinese culture and language. He deployed to Baghdad during the surge, where he directed the Personal Security Coordination Center. General Spalding served as Chief China Strategist for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He served at the White House as Senior Director of Strategic Planning at the National Security Council. He served as defense official and attaché to China. And somehow, during his distinguished career, he found time to earn a doctorate in mathematics and economics from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In short, he's an expert on China, and I'm honored to have him on the show today. Welcome, General.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Oh my! Your book was amazing. I read it. Well, I should say listened to it. I listened to it on Audible, where Ray Porter just does a great job of everything, every bit of inflection that you have in there. He just does so well, and it was amazing and chilling. I was awed and disturbed, like story after story, and all the evidence you cite for your viewpoint. And I guess, to start at this, I think one of the central themes of your book is that we just don't understand China. Their style of governance is ancient and unique and preserved for centuries. Tell us what you mean.
Well, I think it is a little bit ancient, but it's also a little bit, modern in terms of the fact that it's a very IT-based authoritarian regime. Mao was very much a Marxist, very much a socialist, but he was also a historian. So he read a lot of ancient Chinese history, which as I go into in the book, is very much focused, particularly when it comes to things like national security, on subterfuge, on using your adversaries, to fight amongst each other. It's very much a different point of view and outlook when it comes to national power. And I think, the Chinese Communist Party has been very good at doing exactly what Deng Xiaoping talked about, which was hide our capability and bide our time. And I think, we don't understand either kind of the Asian point of view, or because the Chinese Communist Party is so, they obscure everything, we don't actually understand the party. So it is a blend of new and old, but at the same time, it is a very authoritarian, or I would even say totalitarian regime.
Okay, so it's the CCP specifically that's playing the long game. It's not so much a part of Chinese culture, but rather a strategy by the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, Mao Zedong came up with this idea called People's War. And People's War is really about political warfare. It's ideological warfare. It's really about using the population against the incumbent power. And that's because the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, had all the weapons, they had all the money, they had all the power, and Mao was trying to basically overthrow the Nationalist Party. And the way that he did that was by, essentially propagandizing the population, convincing them that the Nationalist Party were corrupt. They were totalitarians. They were. But at the same time, he was able to overthrow them to basically win the Revolutionary War, send the Nationalist Party packing to Taiwan, but then establish, the dictatorship that is the Chinese Communist Party model today. So they threw off one totalitarian for another is essentially what happened.
Interesting. Now, as far as the Chinese people, Do they view the CCP as a dynasty? Does that help mollify them, or how do they look at the CCP? They're not a king.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the empires were the legitimacy was based on kind of the heaven's mandate. In other words, the emperor was given the mandate by heaven to rule over the Chinese people. At the end of the day, though, often what would happen with these empires is they would become corrupt. They would essentially stop, providing the kind of governance that the population needed, and then they would be overthrown or conquered. I think in terms of what the Chinese Communist Party has done, and this is in particular since the arrival of Deng Xiaoping, is they've modified kind of the Soviet Union's model of socialist government to bring in a social contract with the Chinese people. So rather than Xi Jinping having the mandate of heaven, he has a mandate of legitimacy based on a social contract that says, we will deliver jobs to you, the Chinese people, if you agree that there is no other party but the Chinese Communist Party. And so as long as they can deliver economic growth on a consistent basis that leads to full employment, that social contract provides the Chinese Communist Party with all the legitimacy they need.
And that's what is this what we're talking about when they say socialism with Chinese characteristics?
That's exactly right. It's perfected over time. So as opposed to, I think, the Soviet Union, which really continued to double down on its model, the Chinese Communist Party has really adapted itself and really tried to, and this is, by the way, very in accordance with the way they look at strategy, adapt to the times and understand what the environment was and mold their system of governments to be very, to take advantage of the way the world was going. The world was opening up, it was connecting, and this provided opportunities that they realized they needed in order to grow economically and continue their hold on power. And they saw, by the way, they studied the fall of the Soviet Union and realized that, their model of, unit level pricing, direct centrally planned economy was didn't work. And they needed to inject some individual initiative into that. And so what they did is, we like to talk about reform and opening up as, instituting of market reforms in China. And really what they did, their key innovation is they unlocked access to capital for economic activity that benefited the Chinese Communist Party. So as long as you're providing jobs, you can have access to capital. But if you're providing jobs that actually contribute to something that the Chinese Communist Party deems as not in their interest, then your access to capital or your ability to do that is cut off. So it's really about appealing to people's greed and aligning that greed, that motivation of greed, to the interest of the Chinese Communist Party. That really is a key innovation.
Yeah, it seems like that written into the Constitution. You have Mao thought, Xi thought with Xi Jinping thought. I saw on YouTube a game show, a Chinese game show, where this robot from the future was coming back and giving quizzes on Xi Jinping thought. And then the contestants had to get it right, as if it was a trivia game. There was really something else. So it seems like they do put this in there. When you talk about this long game, you talk about two specific documents: Unrestricted Warfare and Document 9. What's Unrestricted Warfare?
Well, Unrestricted Warfare is really a description of, and it's written in 1999, and it's a description of the globalized world and how a country uses that world and really, particularly when it's faced with a superior military power, how it uses the opportunity of openness and connectiveness to undermine the superior power, using all means available to the nation state, not just military. And it's primarily about how you use economic, trade, finance, media, politics, propaganda, law, all of these different elements to include viruses, earthquakes, tornadoes. Every aspect that can be used as a weapon is brought to bear in that, and it's called unrestricted warfare, meaning there are no limits. Another way of translating that is war without rules. So it's really about taking your environment and using it, weaponizing it against your adversary in a way that doesn't create the risk of conflict because you're a weaker military power. So you maintain this kind of this meek, sheepish persona, while at the same time you're doing everything you can to undermine the stronger power. That's unrestricted warfare. And then document number 9 is really, it's almost a screed against the liberal democratic order of the West. Human rights, civil liberties, free speech, free trade, freedom of religion, all of these are essentially designed to destroy the Chinese Communist Party by breaking the bonds of legitimacy with the people, because the people become aware that the social contract is deficient because it only gives it freedom in one area, not the kind of comprehensive freedom that universal liberty provides.
Okay, so is the unrestricted warfare almost like their modern day art of war?
It is. It is very much translating art of war into a globalized world.
Okay, and then document 9, we know it's real because I think, if I get these names wrong, let me know. Like Gao Yu, who's a Chinese grandmother, was arrested for leaking it. Although I'm not sure if she actually did. But isn't that an acknowledgement if you arrest somebody for leaking a document?
It's a legitimate internal Chinese Communist Party document. So. The person that comments on it frequently comments on these kinds of documents that are leaked from the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, it was interesting. I went on Mingjing News, who had originally broke it, which is that Chinese news source in New York City, and I linked from the China file to look at the original. Not that I read Chinese, but I just wanted to see, and I got a 404 removed air, and I thought, uh-oh. But I don't know if that's anything, but what you mentioned before, that G specifically, they're talking about getting jobs, opening up capital. And I think the biggest change in this is in 2001, is when they become part of the WTO. Was that like a big watershed moment for them, and when things really start to change?
It really is. Yeah, it really is, because prior to that, no corporation would invest any amount of money in China because every single year there was uncertainty with regard to what the tariff level would be against China. And it was, and so the most favored nation vote in Congress really was based on, do they violate human rights? Remember, they had just come through the Tiananmen massacre in 1989. And do they have a market economy? Neither of which, China would be anywhere near kind of Western standards for human rights or civil liberties or free trade, even today. And so once that was taken away, there was kind of this watershed where U.S. corporations flocked to China. And I was there in 2002 for the first time, and everybody was building a factory in China. And it really became the in vogue thing to do. In fact, Bob Lighthizer, the current U.S. Trade Representative, wrote an article in the New York Times that appeared this morning that really talks about it. It just became the kind of club thing to do. Everybody goes to China to manufacture because that's what everybody does. And since you have low labor controls and low environmental controls, it really allows for high margins. I remember, talking to people back when I was there in China, in Shanghai, buying, containers full of sunglasses to sell at $10 a pair, where they were paying, I think the quote, if I remember at the time, was 25 to 40 cents for these sunglasses. So you just could make a killing. I mean, for 100,000 pairs of sunglasses, you do the math. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, you have like 97% profit margin on that. Now,
right.
So what I was blown away by, and often I'd wonder when I'd hear that like Apple has X billion dollars in China, and why aren't they bringing it here? But they can't. That you can't take money if you go to China as a company, make money in China. It has to stay in China. And I wasn't aware of that.
So, and it's always been that way. In fact, I've talked to people that have had manufacturing facilities in China back even into the 80s, and these people made money, but they were always constantly checking to see if they could repatriate profits, and so but sometimes you couldn't. Well, recently, particularly in 2015, the Chinese Communist Party just has prevented, with strict capital controls, the outflow of any profits. Now, there are instances where some companies are able to get profits out, but by and large corporations like, for instance, Exxon have money there that they can't repatriate, and probably will never be able to repatriate. Yet they count that money on their books, and therein lies kind of the incentive structure, because if you can account those profits on your books, and you as an executive team or as the board of directors can show profits to your shareholders, they don't know that they can't get access to those, so you get compensated as a result. So it really is and it continues to create an incentive system for the people that run the company on behalf of shareholders, without actually letting shareholders know that, yeah, but the company can't actually have access to that money. So it's really kind of clever way to do things.
Yeah, it's almost like if you had a $10 million painting, but you didn't have a buyer for it. Well, and you still claim it as $10 million. When is it really worth that if it's not at all liquid? So that just blows me away. How did that? So if that's been the case since like the 80s and 90s, why was it the big thing to go to China in 2001 when the WTA opens up if you knew you couldn't get the money out?
Well, because it turns out that corporations can do, you can basically trade, use import-export credits in order to kind of trade one thing for another and get money out that way. So there are ways of working around it. But at the end of the day, the real reason is because, like General Motors, I was there in 2002, and General Motors was just killing it in China. And so most of the profit that they were reporting to the market, they were showing in China.
Oh, wow.
And so if you understand how stock prices determine, which really determines the salaries of these executives and board of director types, they want to show those earnings. It doesn't matter if they can't get the earnings out, because ultimately what the market sees is the earnings. And then that goes into the share price. So it's really about boosting your share price. It's less about actually repatriating the cash that you earn. So it's one of those things where, a lot of our economic model has been based on kind of financial shenanigans that, so you report things, but you don't necessarily, on a day over day or year over year basis, you wouldn't say that that's a way that you want to run a business. But as long as you can, have it appear like you are profitable, then that affects your stock price, which affects your stock options, which affects your compensation. And hey, if you're a CEO, you'll be there 3 years anyway. All you want to do is make sure you get out with your vested options.
Yeah, good idea. Good point. They have the golden handcuffs, so to speak, and even if they were fired, there's always contracts. So it's not like when a normal employee gets fired. But even when you say this, okay, so they have this money in China. So I guess it's worth something, because they could buy Chinese goods like, say, component parts and ship them back to America for assembly there. so it's worth something. But it almost seems like some kind of strict control when you compare it to what Chinese stock corporations GM may list X amount of Chinese dollars as part of their assets, but if you have a completely Chinese company on an exchange, that's not even audited at all, right? So at least GM's got Chinese money, but it's subject to some sort of audit, yet Chinese companies don't have any auditing procedure?
Well, I mean, that's so a lot of the things that you bring up are really a result of China being dubbed an emerging market economy at the WTO. So they use this, the fact that the World Trade Organization says that China is an emerging market economy, even though it's a number 2 economy and actually is, on a median per capita income is too high, supposedly, to be an emerging market economy. They continue to have that label. And so that allows them to, for instance, get loans at the World Bank. It allows them to register and list their stocks and bonds on our exchanges and in our capital markets. It allows, for these kind of preferential trade treatments like the postal union, where they get subsidized postage to ship things to the United States. So there's all these benefits for being an emerging market economy, and it's supposed to. It's basically constructed so that as these economies grow and as these countries become more wealthy, there's a theory, the theory of modernization, that they will liberalize, and so they'll become democracies if we just enable them to grow. And so it's been this pattern of behavior by the United States and other developed countries, but mostly just the United States, to allow this kind of behavior to go forward. And of course, it enables a very parasitic relationship to occur.
Yeah, it seems really weird that they don't have to do the audits. They're breaking WTO rules all the time, and we can get into even more of those. I come from medicine and medical technology, medical device, and this is governed by the FDA. And the FDA is extraordinarily strict on what can get through, what kind of labeling, and they have no problem shutting down your manufacturing and completely cutting you out if you don't play by the rules. Is the WTO like the simp version of the FDA? Like, what's going on with the WTO?
Well, I mean, I'll just give you an example. ISO 9001 certification. So ISO 9001, an entity comes and inspects your processes, your factory, your logistics, and they give you this ISO 9001 certification, and it actually enables you to speed through customs. Well, half the ISO 9001 certifications comes from a Chinese company. And so, in a lot of ways, the way that they're engaged and allowed to, and it's just like the audits that you bring up, 90% of the auditing is done by Chinese companies. So having lived in China, what you realize is, nobody basically does anything that would resemble, kind of the United States, where you have a rule of law where you can't just blatantly falsify documents and then not, find yourself either civilly or criminally liable for some kind of punishment. In China, it just doesn't happen. So, there's liberal cheating on documents, and so it's just a different way of running a system. But when it comes into connection, or it begins to be associated with a society that actually behaves according to the rules or by the rules, then it really provides Chinese companies and individuals an advantage. Because so here, and it's almost like, and my wife and I talk about this almost as like it's a cultural DNA defect of Americans, in that we've been so accustomed to rule of law and institutions that actually enforce rules and enforce you to play by the rules, that when we go over to China and we sign a contract, or we make a deal, or we have a promise. We just expect it's going to be fulfilled. And when you get over there, it takes you, for me, it took a year. It took 1 year of living in China to kind of break my habit patterns and realize that for everything that I was going to do in China, I needed to understand that I had to have leverage in the relationship. I had to have a reason for the person I was dealing with to deal with me in good faith. Now, usually the way this works in a transaction at the, just buying something on the street is, if it's anything that you're concerned about the quality or the product delivery, you don't pay full price up front. You may give half with the rest, due upon delivery and, agreement that the product that's being delivered is exactly what you asked for. So now some business people from the US go over there with this expectation and actually do quite well. But there's a nice book called Made Poorly in China that describes how people get lulled into this false sense of security by the first deal going well. And so then they'll just, go on faith that every subsequent deal with the same parties will be similar. And what they find in this book, it's hilarious because time after time, these business people, end up losing because they forget to actually, the whole Reagan saying about trust but verify, they forget to verify. And then that's when the other party will say, okay, well, if you're not going to force me to do this by looking at me and checking my work, then I'm gonna cut corners, and I'm gonna see how much money I can squeeze out of the relationship just because you're too stupid to know that you shouldn't be trusting me.
Yeah, it's almost like a hustle. The person that pretends to be bad at pool or something, but then comes back and and beats you, and all this long game was on purpose. One of the books one of the examples in the book that you cited, and this one just gave me chills. I could remember exactly where I was when I read it. It was a green energy company that was hacked by the Chinese military, and the idea was this slow piece of stealing emails, of changing work orders. They had hacked everything, so the company would slowly lose sales. And wow.
That's when I saw that, I was actually in the Pentagon, and that presentation had been created by one of our top audit firms in the country. And it wasn't just that vignette. There were so many other vignettes, and they were all different in subtle ways. But the tradecraft that was involved and how they were so successful in doing what they did, it was a level of sophistication. And I likened it at the time to an air campaign where you have essentially deception that's built into the air campaign that makes you think you're going after one thing and you're going after another, and but there's layers of sophistication, but it's all choreographed and supremely done, professionally done. When I looked at these vignettes, of which is the one that you're describing, that's one of them. The sophistication, the choreography, the real. I mean, it was almost like that Ocean's 11 movie where there's so much that goes into it in sleight of hand. And these companies, for the most part, are really caught unawares. And it's only one little minor slip up, or somebody that's just too perfect that really ends up blowing it. And then they call in auditors and eventually find out what's going on. But what you realize is, if this is going on, there's so much more that we're not aware of that's going on that never goes detected. And people just. They tend to think like, wow, I'm not a very good businessman or not a very good businesswoman, when in reality, they've just been completely hustled.
Yeah, it's really something else. And there's a lot of people that are middle class that think, well, I don't really care what happens to X business. I'm not a business owner. I'm just a worker. But this has had a massive impact on them in so much as the outsourcing of jobs. And I've seen this, and I've always thought that it was a bit of, well, greed from, say, a small business, saying, well, I'll just make a little bit more money. But in the book, you say Walmart has actually been driving some of this. And again, didn't know that. Can you explain a little bit of how this is playing into it?
Well, I mean, I think it is very much kind of two forces acting at the same time. One is the offshoring of manufacturing to areas of lower regulation of labor and environment. But it is also the consolidation of industry in America that's happened in not just in retail like Walmart, but in banking, in manufacturing, in transportation and logistics. In nearly just about every industry, we've seen enormous consolidation, and that efficiency really enables these companies to compete with what is a very upside down or very tilted game board that they're playing on. So, in a lot of ways, these companies can only compete by growing larger and essentially, in effect, partnering with China to promote their social model. So, I mean, Walmart is an example. I think Amazon's an even better one because it really talks about how Amazon has used its platform not just to sell the products for companies that are in the United States. So you develop and market and create advertising campaigns for a new product, doing well on Amazon, and then Amazon, has these hundreds of thousands of sellers from China that basically counterfeit, use the same marketing, advertising, and actually the same page for the product on Amazon, and then turns around and sell and then outcompetes you by lowering the price because the product is counterfeit. This kind of behavior is going on and on and on, and people don't realize how pervasive it is, not just on Amazon, on eBay, on Shopify. And we have created this system where, with all this consolidation, the ability for the small business owner to really be competitive in a global marketplace in the United States is just, it's almost impossible. And there's a few stories in there of just companies getting creamed.
Yeah. And you mentioned that. And that's the idea of the American dream, that if you want, you can quit your job, go out, form your company, and be able to sell and get your customers. But you could be established and they're going to come in, undercut you, and there's not much you can do. And again, I just looked at this and I said, wow, this is kind of an American dream destroyer.
It very much is. It's an American society destroyer because, go back to those jobs that you mentioned that people lose in small businesses. So I was in a factory in central Pennsylvania, a furniture factory, about a year ago, walking the factory floor. And this factory had been in business, I think, for over 100 years. And, it'd come under pressure from Chinese, dumping of furniture products in the market. And, as we were kind of touring the facility, there were people coming up to our vehicle, that had been working there for 30 years. So imagine this is going on in 2019 in central Pennsylvania. But, from 2001, when China entered the WTO, this was going on in tens of thousands of communities all over the United States. In fact, some of these factories were taken up brick by brick, and each brick was marked with location and then put on a ship and shipped over to China. And lots of equipment was sent over there. So and a lot of times these employees were the ones that had to, take apart their factory and put it on a ship and watch it shipped over to China, where it basically would sell the products to them. And now they're looking at, that particular factory I just mentioned, that was in a county of a population of 20,000. That factory brought in almost $1 billion in economic activity to that county, that now all those families lost their health benefits, lost their retirement benefits. $1 billion of economic activity was pulled out of that county of 20,000. Where is it going to get that? Well, it's going to go basically, it's going to have to get that from the state and federal governments. So what you've seen, and this is what it started for me, really looking at our industrial base, but what you see really quickly is it's destroying the very fabric of our society as these 5 million manufacturing jobs go away. Because each manufacturing job has about 4 jobs in the community that support it, whether you're running a dry cleaner or a restaurant or, car repair shop. All of these different people are, it's a functioning community. And all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, I'm going to take your factory away. Guess what, though? We're going to bring a Walmart in. We're going to close all the little 5 and dime stores around here, and you're going to be able to go to that Walmart because it's so much more efficient. And we don't pay labor and high labor costs, and we don't care about the environment, so we can give really low margins, which means Walmart can squeeze the manufacturers, which means you get cheaper prices. But at the end of the day, you don't have a life. I mean, that your life is basically shopping at Walmart because your livelihood went away. And I think if you look at kind of some of the social ills in our society, the whole thing kind of begins to make sense, and that's what happened for me.
Yeah, it sounds like you mentioned environmental regulations. Why aren't we thinking of like the American industrial base like an ecology? Like if you get rid of the coral reef, all of the fish and all of the life around it goes away. So if we pull that base of manufacturing, of course, yeah, we're going to lose restaurants. We're gonna lose every widget that goes to manufacture this, and it's more than that. We're not even necessarily getting the cheap prices, because what they've done with, say, rare earth metals and like the neodymium and the lanthanum, that they've subsidized the industry so you can make it so cheap in China that 90% of the business goes over there. And once they have the market captured, they jack up the prices 3 times. And there's nothing you can do because the handful of other pieces they can't supply enough. This is like taking drugs. They're bad.
Well, it's funny because if you studied economics, what you just described as market failure. It's called monopoly, and we've been playing into it for a long time. And but yet we have all of these very respected theoretical economists that have been criticizing the current administration for basically placing tariffs on China for this behavior, when they'll go and teach economics class and say, well, this is what market failure looks like, and they'll say, well, the tariffs are actually distorting the free market. Well, you have to actually have a free market for tariffs to distort. And what I would say is that we don't have a free market because a lot of these prices aren't actually set by the market; they're set by China. And it's really an interesting case of where theoretical economics and empirical economics are at loggerheads, because the empiricists will tell you we've got a problem, and the theoretical economists will just basically not pay any attention. One of the other things that you see with this, and I don't talk about in the book, but you really have to understand, is that usually when you have trade between 2 countries that's one-sided, there's an alternating trade or an offsetting trade in currency that tends to balance that. Because if you're buying a bunch of stuff, then that country is getting a bunch of your currency, and pretty soon that currency trade forces the price of their products up so that there's more of an equilibrium in prices, and then you begin to have a balancing of trade. So this is kind of a self-equalizing mechanism. But China has a closed financial system, and so their producers get hard currency like dollars and then go to the Bank of China. They don't go to a currency market. They go to the Bank of China, and the Bank of China buys hard currency for RMB at a discount. They turn around and then buy assets in America with that hard currency. So, as long as we allow them to, conduct this, they can basically drain. It's almost like having a permanent drain built into our economy that just sucks value out of it every single day.
Yeah. And speaking of that drain, it's not just in the jobs, which again, that ecosystem of our industry we need to care about, but you also mentioned that it's the pension plans, that if we have money invested over there, you talk about these massive ghost cities where they're building these gigantic cities for people to come into the countryside, but you go there at night, there's no lights on at all. It's chilling, but yet every home there, every apartment, every office building is still listed at like $135,000 when there's no demand. So we're investing in this, and I got to believe that you think you have these investments of all this Chinese real estate, but you don't have anything. Will this kill our 401ks if we do this?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah. So, I mean, what we do, what we have been doing during every financial crisis. So remember, we had the dot-com bust, and then we had the real estate bust, which led to the financial collapse in 2008. Every single time we've had one of these financial collapses post-Cold War, what we've done is essentially boost the cash in the financial markets. So, we do quantitative easing. We basically flush money into the banking system because we believe that let the private sector sort out, because they're the best ones to determine where that capital should be best allocated. And in reality, what has been happening is that capital ends up finding its way to China because it's being lent for, as you say, real estate, and because the Chinese are using the cash to basically continue to employ their people. So they've been doing kind of fiscal stimulus continuously to goose their economy in order to keep people employed. And so it ends up over there. And of course, it never finds its way back. And a lot of these banks, after 2008, lent money to real estate projects in China. And the same thing's going on with the World Bank. They're taking billions of dollars at very low interest rates from the World Bank because they're considered an emerging market economy. And then the AIIB or the China Development Bank are taking that money that they've got at really low interest rates from the World Bank because they're an emerging market economy, and they're lending it at a steep markup to other emerging market economies to build them a port or a stadium or a railroad, and they're actually making money by arbitrage of this World Bank money that's meant to help countries that need it. So I mean, everything they do is really I find to be fascinating because it's so underhanded and really, but at the same time, if you think about it, if we're going to let them do it, I mean, and you're going to allow it to do it decade after decade, and then of course, why wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. If you're not punishing it, why do it? In Wisconsin specifically, we had a lot of hubbub about a Foxconn coming in here. We checked that out. It's Terry Gao, and again, if I'm screwing up the names, I apologize. It's a Taiwanese company. And generally, we think of Taiwan as an ally, but Foxconn's massive. I think it's the biggest employer in Shenzhen, China. At least I've read that. And now they want to make a plant in Wisconsin. They don't know exactly what it's going to be made there because everything's a trade secret. That's what I could find out in the news. Like, how do you know what's what? Like, what do we know about Foxconn?
Yeah. So Terry Go is first of all, if you run into him, the requirement is that you call him the chairman. He won't address you unless you call him the chairman. He's the chairman of Foxconn. He won't respond to Terry or Mr. Go. You got to call him chairman. That's one thing that you need to know about him. The other thing you need to know about him is before he went to Wisconsin with a plant, several years ago, he was in Pennsylvania, basically telling him that they were going to build a plant in Pennsylvania. And there was a big press announcement in Pennsylvania, and then they went and had one in Washington, D.C. And of course, no plant ever appeared in Pennsylvania. So when that plant was announced in Wisconsin, I knew that there was not going to be any manufacturing going on there because there was never any intent, because that's one of the things that is used. One of the things that's the techniques that's used is to get political support by promising something and then not delivering. I'll also refer you to the $80 billion West Virginia natural gas investment that was promised when President Trump went over to meet with President Xi back in 2017. So they said that we're going to have $80 billion natural gas investment. I think this might have been around the same time that the Wisconsin Foxconn plant was promised. So, I mean, this happens time and time again, investment promises, but they never actually materialize.
Yeah, I've seen that you document that in your book a lot, is making promises or making statements that are oblique, that don't actually, that sound like we're going to follow the rules, but don't make any commitments to do that. And
yeah, because of course the politicians are going to follow through on what they promised, because it's the United States. That's what we do. Make a promise. And certainly, you know that you're going to get, your constituents are going to have jobs. Why wouldn't you as a politician want to do that? And that in a lot of ways, that's what's going on here. Now, I would not doubt that if you remember when that was going on, the president was making noises about tariffs. That Terry Go got a big chunk of cash from the Chinese Communist Party to make this deal in Wisconsin. I don't doubt it at all. Now, Terry Go subsequently ran for president in Taiwan with the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, and of course, the Nationalist Party was considered the party that wanted to be close to Beijing. So that kind of gives you an indication of his political leanings. Foxconn has many factories in China, as you mentioned, with hundreds of thousands of employees. So Terry Go is very much a creature that has strong ties and relationship with the Chinese Communist Party.
So what's the end game? What do they want to do? Like convince a Wisconsin senator, for example, to push Trump on the tariffs?
Well, I think the jig is up. So, the tariffs happened, and so now you get to see kind of the real motivation behind that. I don't think it's ever gonna amount to anything unless you see some change in and this could be what comes out of the coronavirus is this acceleration in tariffs and other punitive measures that forces a reshoring of manufacturing. Like, Bob Lighthizer today, the U.S. Trade Representative, had an article in the New York Times saying the era of offshoring U.S. manufacturing is done. Yeah. And he mentions the 5 million jobs that were lost. So, I mean, it could be that, that it actually becomes something, but it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be Foxconn, or maybe it is, but they're going to be looking for some other kind of financial incentive to make that happen. Yeah.
We ran a charity podcast for COVID as soon as the lockdowns began, and somebody on that podcast asked, what is there any good things that are going to be coming out of COVID? And I looked at it and I didn't see it at that point, but I think that if the one thing that comes, it is China, because you do have a warning in the book, and I think you preface this at the beginning, that if this isn't taken seriously within 3 years, it may be too late.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen with the current administration is particularly after, I mark about the first quarter of 2018. At the end of the first quarter, you really start to see enforcement pick up across the federal government. And so in December, the National Security Strategy is released, and it basically points a finger directly at these issues that we're talking about right now as being emblematic of the decline of the United States. And what we need to do to reverse them is actually begin to protect our industry in ways that promote job growth in the United States and promote investment in the United States. And I think so in the first quarter, you began to have enforcement. DOJ, FBI, State Department, Commerce, Treasury, USTR beginning to really sink their teeth into what the Chinese Communist Party was doing. And I think what the coronavirus has done is really, put a bullseye squarely on the Chinese Communist Party for the American people. And I think it'll result in an acceleration of those efforts.
Yeah. And you mentioned that this book's a nonpartisan book. You're not trying to push, you've got to vote for Trump or this and that. You're saying this is for the right and the left. My father is a business owner where he ran an engineering and manufacturing firm. what he says a lot with outsourcing of these jobs is that you lose what he calls the foreman's ability. That you have all these shop foremans, and they almost function in some way like the NCOs in the military, that you can't lose that knowledge. If we outsource at all, we're not going to have it. You can't just bring it back then, because that knowledge needs to be passed down from foreman to worker to the next foreman. Do you see that, and what would you propose for how do we get it back? Because we have a bunch of atrophy, right? How would we get it back, and how would it be done?
Well, I mean, it's going to have to be done kind of by the bootstraps, because, we moved a lot of people over to China to teach the Chinese how to manufacture. And so a lot of those skill sets are gone. I think one of the changes that you have right now and opportunities is increased automation in manufacturing. So a lot of those jobs won't need to come back because they'll be automated. That being said, there will grow up an ecosystem that's actually involves more jobs being available with regard to this manufacturing. The other thing is, I've been very hopeful that we are going to build the first kind of really, high-tech AI platform for autonomous vehicles and, advanced logistics and manufacturing, which is really the 5G technology. The problem is it's not secure today, and it really needs to be made secure. And I think, if we can do that, if we can use the technology that the Department of Defense has, instituted in its networks in order to protect, data and really deploy that in this kind of way, then I think you're going to see the kind of advancements in what's called Industry 4.0, which is really advanced, everything, and automation and robotics and artificial intelligence really kind of help lead to this resurgence in manufacturing and industry in the United States.
Yeah, because like you mentioned, we have the technology for a 5G system, but we don't have the capacity to build the phones, at least on a large scale at all. Maybe just enough for the military, and maybe not even that much. So go on.
No, I was going to say there is very little microelectronic manufacturing here in the United States, and that also is by design. The Chinese have essentially monopolized that production capacity using some very sophisticated kind of component pricing schemes that, the components may be manufactured in the United States that go into circuit boards, but they're bought in bulk, and really every Chinese manufacturer can have the same price on that component, so that when a U.S. manufacturer tries to manufacture those circuit boards and they go to the company that's making the component, say capacitor or a semiconductor, that company will say, well, you're going to pay, 100 times the price that China is, because China is buying in such bulk. So it's just another example of how, by being much more of a centrally planned economy, that the Chinese can essentially take advantage of our industry and really make it uncompetitive for anybody to do microelectronic manufacturing here in the U.S. And so you really government has to take a leading role in really breaking up these monopolies, and hopefully that'll be the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. Last question, and you see this a little bit, especially from the Bernie Sanders crowd, where they're talking about free college, and that's something that they want. But yet you mentioned that there is a serious need for us to invest in our own people for STEM specifically. Could you imagine some kind of compromise, through, say, guided by the military, maybe, because it seems to be the one institution that still has broad respect from left and right, to train and give free college to people that do want to go into engineering and certain fields, especially that we really need?
Yeah, well, so I mean, Eisenhower had an interesting perspective about warfare. He thought military should be used for deterrence, and that the real strength of a society was in the economy and the science and technology. So during the Cold War, we used our military to prevent war, to basically, essentially tell the Soviet Union if we went to war, it would be a total war. And so that allowed us to then invest the bulk of our money in the economy and infrastructure and science and technology and STEM education. These are the things that we invested in during the Cold War, and consequently, it led to our, winning the Cold War. What's happened since the end of the Cold War is that we've built, all kinds of weapon systems to the tune now where we've got an $800 billion per year Department of Defense that's focused on buying weapons, which we employ abroad. But China has taken a lot of their money and invested in infrastructure and science and technology and STEM education. And so it's really, trying to get back to that where the military is not used for war, it's used to prevent war, and that our real investment is going into our economy and our society. And I think if we do that, you're going to see a big difference.
Yeah, and I think just raising this issue, it seemed you mentioned that that's the reason you got out of the Air Force was this message is that important that you meant to deliver it. And I just really think you're a patriot for doing that, and it is super important. You definitely convinced me. The book is amazing. Everything that we've talked about here, if you're listening, is expanded on in huge detail. So if you like to read books, great. If you do, grab it by Audible. If you just want to listen it, in the car or something, or when we go back to work, like on your way to work, I can't recommend it more highly. I've already listened to it twice, and I'm getting more each time. It's called Stealth War, How China Took Over While the Elite Slept by General Robert Spalding. You can also follow him on Twitter at Robert_Spalding. His Twitter feed's really good. He's pretty active on there. He understands the Twitter and how to do it. Thanks again for joining us. I'm really excited to be able to talk to you, and just really appreciate what you're doing and just really admire the standpoint.
Thank you, and it's